this should pique the interest of cyclists hearing this one. You've got a multi-stage event. Your next day is a lot of climbing. Can I reduce my body weight by restricting sodium in order to keep my body weight down so I can climb faster? Thanks for listening to this final part of the review of Dr. Alan McCubbin's review paper on sodium intake before, during, and after exercise and future recommendations. Look, this final part is definitely one you want to listen to because we do a little quick recap on some areas around sodium intake during exercise that I think are really important for athletes. We also cover the fact that this is a review paper and get Alan's take on that because, there is always a risk of bias. And then finally, we do cover sodium intake after exercise and the implications and the thought processes you should have when considering taking on sodium after exercise and why you're doing it. Always come back to the why. Anyway, it's a fantastic episode. Alan and I have a great chat about all things sodium, all things post-exercise consumption, and future thoughts around sodium research and what it could mean for all athletes, age groupers, competitive and elite. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, maybe a bottle of electrolytes, and enjoy. Al, how are you doing, mate?
Yeah, pretty good. It's going to be a scorcher here. But they're talking possibly the hottest day ever in Melbourne, so not looking forward to that, but probably on topic for what we're discussing today.
Hey, very on topic, but my parents both live in the country and Dad was saying it was 43.5 degrees Celsius in the shade on the back veranda the other day. And they've got another week of that, which, I said, are you hydrating properly? And he said, don't worry, I'm drinking enough water. And I said, oh, that's good. And he actually asked, should I be taking in some sodium? So like you say, it's probably a really good sort of segue into this final and third part. I think a couple of things I wanted to recap on as we get into this third and final episode of our 3-part deep dive into your review paper. I think firstly, I wanted to cover and just acknowledge that it is a review paper. I think, a recent review on carbohydrates and that we've apparently been sold a lie after 70 years of supporting research about their ergogenic impact on performance has caught the attention of a lot of people on social media. Unfortunately, how do I put this? A lot of people who read the abstract or maybe the title then said, oh my God, we've been sold a lie and said that carbs aren't required. What they failed to recognize that it was authored by some fairly strongly opinionated low carb, high fat advocates. I won't say zealots, although some may. Tim Noakes, Jeff Volek, Prins et al. And that paper's also been met by a lot of heavy criticism by individuals who actually took the time to read the paper, read the research that was being discussed and what was being positioned as fact versus maybe, I don't know if you want to call it fiction, but certainly it was very opinionated. And I think, so then we come to your paper, which is a review paper as well. It's not a research paper, although it covers a lot of research, including your own research. Is there a risk of bias in your review on this? Because I think it is something, I've been thinking about the last 2 episodes and saying, okay, we're covering this paper. Al's involved in research. His interest, his PhD was in sodium. What do you say to that?
Yeah, no, it's a valid question, and I think the first answer is there will inherently be some level of bias because I'm human, and if you're human, you have bias. And to say that you don't is you're kidding yourself, basically. Probably Absolutely. A form of bias in and of itself, to be honest. Bias takes many different forms. It can be subtle. It can be very overt. There's a whole I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there's a whole list of different types of biases that people can potentially have. There's things like anchor bias, where you're most likely to believe the first thing that you're told about something, and then basically it takes irrefutable evidence to change your mind on that, and sometimes even that's not enough. There's confirmation bias, where you want to things that confirm what you already believe, you're more likely to take on board and be less critical of, compared to things that contradict what you already believe, that you're likely to be highly critical of. And I think that's one that's definitely played out on social media in the last week with that carbohydrate paper that you just mentioned. I guess the other thing that comes around discussions of bias is conflicts of interest as well. And, people talk about commercial conflicts of interest, and that's been thrown around in the carbohydrate debate quite a lot, in terms of the role of different nutrition companies that sell carbohydrate-containing products, for example. I think the area of bias that doesn't get talked about enough is what I would call, and I don't know if this is an official term, but intellectual conflict of interest. And that sort of feeds into that bias in terms of people are wedded to their ideas, and that creates a conflict of interest where they're more likely to promote that idea or other people who promote that idea, and seek to discredit or tear down ideas that sort of conflict with your own. And so in academic research, yes, there can be potentially commercial conflicts of interest, but from my personal experience, I think the intellectual conflicts of interest are far greater often in academic researchers. If you think about what motivates a researcher, often it is that wanting to be right, quote unquote, whatever that means. So coming back to my own paper, I guess I came into the topic, and I think it was a good place to come into it, not having a huge preconceived idea about what the outcome is going to be, should be, or what I want it to be, because I didn't really care what I wanted it to be. I only cared what's going to help the athletes that I work with, because I was a practitioner before I was a researcher. And so I was a practitioner for sort of 10 odd years prior to getting into the research side of things. And so for me, it was sort of being an outside observer in many ways, observing some of the debate that was happening in hydration and electrolytes. And some of the names you mentioned before were central to that debate as well. And again, the same sort of accusations, very similar to what's played out with carbohydrate, but I was an outsider at that time, so I was able to sort of see both sides of that, and didn't really care where the truth fell, and I always figured it was probably somewhere in the middle, but just wanted to figure out what that is, and was frustrated by the lack of research going on to try and figure out what that is. A lot of words being exchanged, but not much research actually answering those questions. And so that's essentially why I got into this field for. And I think when you look through the paper, I think that's kind of probably what you would come to a conclusion of if you read it and sort of interpreted it yourself is, okay, here's someone who's not completely anti-sodium or electrolytes. I'm not saying in there that you should avoid sodium completely or that it's all a cooked up conspiracy or anything like that. But at the same time, it's not, massively pro-sodium either, that, you should be replacing every milligram of sodium that you lost. It was really about trying to explore the unanswered questions and try and put some answers to those questions. And is there going to be some bias in there? Well, I'm human, so yes, there probably is. I'm probably blind to them myself, because that's generally what happens with our own biases. But hopefully I've tried to go through that middle ground with as little bias as I can, and being aware of where that might stand.
Mate, I really appreciate that answer, and I think a lot of people listening will as well. Like, even those that maybe are listening to this 3-part series and going, oh my God, like, okay, they're really, diving into sodium and what it means. And I think when I read the paper and I read the review paper, I think that balance does come out. You're definitely not anti-sodium. And I don't think,
No.
Again, maybe some bias there, because I read it and I was like, well, I'm not anti-sodium either. And I'm not, am I pro-carb? Yeah. Am I anti-keto? Probably, in light of, with respect to athletic performance. Yeah, I am. And that's my bias based on the research. Is it maybe useful for epileptic individuals? Yeah, maybe based on the research. But when it comes to sodium, I felt like you put forward a pretty balanced review. to be honest. It wasn't like, I think when we saw social media posts about this paper, it wasn't like, oh, we've got it all wrong with sodium, you sold a lie. It was like, well, maybe you just need to think about the way you approach fluids and sodium together rather than just in this sort of silo mentality. And I think I thought that was a really well-structured, sort of presented perspective on the topic. So, I'm sure people will disagree and have their bias to that, but, I think that's good. In terms of confirmation bias, I think absolutely. I think we all are guilty of that, aren't we? And I certainly will hold myself up that, I probably go in with things like I'm very pro carbs or I'm very pro, caffeine or something like that. And to be told that that's not the case, I really need to sort of detach from that view and try and read the research available. But at this point in time, I'm still very pro carb and very pro caffeine, I guess, if we're using those two examples. The commercial bias, I think it is something that I'm very conscious of. Obviously, with Fuel In, we have partners, and some of those partners do provide or sell products that are electrolytes. I'm still very pro those products. I think they have a place, as you said. They have a place in athletic performance when required and when dealt with in the correct way. So we're certainly not anti that. And then I think in terms of, you're right, the intellectual bias, it's the proving maybe what you want to prove. And it can. And look, I've never done any research in that respect. So I can only take your word for that that's certainly what can happen. So yeah, look, I think it is a review paper for everyone. As we've said, we've got the notes there and we've got the link that everyone can read that and review what we've covered in these 3-part series. And certainly, keep your mind open to what has been discussed by Alan in the review and think about it from that perspective. The second thing I wanted to recap, Al, was we obviously talked about during exercise and sodium or electrolyte sodium replacement. And I often get this question, and I forgot to cover it, and I'm not sure why, but it was the question that, like, my event's longer than 4 hours. Now, based on your review, events over 4 hours, athletes can start to consider, replacing sodium in their fluids in line with their fluid replacement percentage. But I train less than 4 hours, but my event's over 4 hours. How should I approach fluid intake and sodium replacement during training? Because, you want to practice what's going to happen on race day. Nothing new on race day sort of analogy. Mm. What's your opinion on that, and what's your experience? How do you approach that from a practical perspective with athletes?
Yeah. And I think this goes not just for sodium. You could say this equally for carbohydrate or for fluid replacement as well. Look, I think for me, you're spot on. You should never go into a race or competition of whatever type it is, having not, dialed in what you're doing in training first. That said, a season is long, and if you're only racing, say, 2 or 3 events or 2 or 3, really long events in the year, you don't necessarily have to train like that all year round either. So I guess the way I would approach that is thinking about, and I often think about sort of the last sort of 10 to 12 weeks leading into an event as being that crucial sort of preparation stage for that event. And that's where you might be purposefully training with the volumes of fluid, the quantities of sodium, the amounts of carbohydrate, and the specific products that you're planning to use on race day to get used to those. It's going to mean then planning ahead of what you intend to do on race day and then trying to replicate that in training. Obviously, it might be a scaled down version because the duration of training might be shorter. But if we think about sodium in terms of milligrams per hour, it's just the same milligrams per hour over less hours in those training sessions. So, I don't think you necessarily need to do that all year round, but in that sort of last preparation phase, that last sort of 3 months leading in, I guess you'd ramp up how frequently you're doing that, both in terms of the amounts, but also the specific products that you're using.
Yeah, that's exactly the way that I tend to talk to athletes about that, is that approach of, as you focus on the race, let's start to dial in your hydration strategy, which will be your fluid replacement, coupled with your sodium, and then how does the carbs fit into that? If you were, and so given that the training sessions are shorter, do you still recommend sort of, even though it is shorter, that, okay, on the bike, let's aim for sort of, a 70, 80% of your total fluid loss? Or how do you approach it in those shorter sessions for your athletes?
Yeah. The other thing that I forgot to add before is a little bit depends also on the environmental conditions that you're training in versus your racing. So the classic example I use being here in Melbourne is the Ironman athlete who trains through our winter here and then travels to Kona in October. It's still pretty cold at that time of year here. And then they're going into that very hot environment. And so, yes, you can work backwards and say, well, in Kona, I expect my sweat rate to be this, therefore I need this much fluid. That's a lot more than I actually need here in training, but I'm going to do that to get my gut used to that volume of fluid, etc. But if you're then drinking, 1.5 times your sweat rate in training, one of two things is going to happen. One, you could be at risk of hyponatremia, although it's not that common. Or the other risk is you're just going to have to stop and pee an awful lot during training, which is very inconvenient and interrupting that training session. So it is a bit of a balancing act from that perspective to sort of meet those two different goals. I guess that's where using sort of heat acclimation training or deliberately layering up to try and increase your sweat rate to kind of justify the higher fluid intake so they're more in sync might be helpful as well. So it's not always the easiest one. What I would generally tend to do is try to work out, we've talked in previous episodes that the amount of fluid that you need will vary even within the same race. So let's use Kona as the example. You go to Kona in the morning, it's cooler as you start the bike, and then by the end of the bike it's going to be a lot hotter, and your sweat rate, even if your power output, your speed, everything is the same, will probably change from the start of the bike to the end of the bike because the weather conditions have changed. Obviously, depending on the day, a cool change could come through maybe at a different location, and it could go the other way. It could get cooler rather than hotter. So I guess the point there is that sweat rate isn't just this fixed value that's going to stay the same across the whole event that you're doing. And so we need some flexibility in our fluid intakes. And so the way I would think about that in training is train for the worst case scenario. You want your gut to be able to tolerate what's going to happen if it's unseasonably hot in that environment. What's the most amount of fluid realistically I'm ever going to need to replace, and make sure I do some training at that level. And then sodium would go along with that, because we talked in the last episode that the sodium replacement is really there to match what you're doing with the fluid replacement. So again, think about the fluid first and then work backwards. What does that mean in terms of sodium replacement?
Yeah, that's exactly how I would approach it. It's funny you mention as well we know that the sweat rate is going to change based on the environmental temperature, as you said, and in the mornings it's generally cool. Then they go through that period of much hotter, sort of, gets the sun's up, and obviously, and then by the end of the race, some of those athletes will be racing in the dark. And so sweat rate's going to drop a lot. I guess, and I talked about this actually when I did an episode with, mental blank, who came second at the Western States 100 miler with Andy Blow recently, Chris Myers. And we talked specifically about this. Did he try and adjust his sweat rate, his fluid intake based on what he thought his sweat rate would be across the day, or just keep it very steady all the way through, thinking, okay, well, if I get more in at the start, that may cover the inability to get in when it gets really hot and I'm sweating a lot? And I actually tend to go that approach. Just keep it simple. We know pretty much what your fluid rate is, and we're going to go that upper end of it. And so at the start, you may be taking on more than what you require, but you'll probably catch up as you go. That tends to be my approach. Do you do that approach again, like on the bike or on the run, or do you sort of say, okay, it's going to be cooler here, take less, as it gets hotter, take more? What's your approach?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on what the difference between those two extremes might be. If that difference is relatively small, then what you just described, I think, will be fine. If the difference is very large, and there's probably less so in triathlon, maybe more so in ultra running, where it is like daytime and nighttime as well, that's where I'd be thinking, okay, well, if the difference is like a threefold difference in fluid intake or fluid needs, over maybe 5, 10, 15 hours, then maybe that approach is going to result in either having to pee a lot or potentially risking hyponatremia just to cover the potential for fluid deficit later on. It probably also depends on, at that hottest time of the day, how easy or difficult it is to actually meet your fluid needs. If it's easy enough to meet those needs, then anyway, you don't really need to bank the gains earlier. So again, a little bit of context there. Whereas if that sweat rate is going to be very high and you know there's no chance of actually meeting that fluid requirement, then banking a little bit more makes some sense. The way I tend to do it is to have kind of a fixed volume of fluid that I know I'm going to need regardless of what the weather's doing. And that fixed volume of fluid, you can say, okay, well, I can put carbohydrate into that fluid because I'm going to get a consistent amount every time. So therefore, I'm going to get a consistent amount of carbohydrate every hour, or however you want to describe it. And then I have a variable part of the fluid. And that's the part that I can adjust based on feedback during the event in terms of how thirsty I'm feeling, that kind of thing. Now, I want to do some testing and training because thirst doesn't always tell you perfectly well how well hydrated or not you are. For some people, it's a pretty good guide. For some people, it's not great, and you've kind of got to recalibrate that, I guess, how you interpret it a little bit. But I'd be thinking about that. So what I want to make sure is I've got access to the worst case scenario amount of fluid, and I've trained my gut prior to the event that I can tolerate that should I need it. But I'm not going out there saying I have to drink that no matter what. I'm going to drink that if I'm getting really thirsty, it's getting really hot. But if it's not and I'm not feeling thirsty, I can back it off a little bit. And it's hard because, you know, during an event, there's no way of really knowing at any given point in time where you are. There's no dipstick. You know, you're not going to stop, get off and weigh yourself on a set of scales to see where you're at compared to where you started and then calculate from there. So, you know, thirst is really the only indicator we've got in real time of what's going on. But we need to know beforehand of how reliable that is, because for some people it's very reliable and for some people it's not so reliable.
Yeah, it's so true though, isn't it? The practical element of it, and in the theory can all be great, but as you said, like when you get to those extended durations, you really don't have an idea. It comes down to feel as much as anything, and that thirst drive is part of that feel. You mentioned that fixed volume, and that's certainly, you know, what I would advocate as well. With that additional fluid, generally water, is that what you're using? Sort of, you're saying, hey, pick up water if and when you want, and that's sort of your variant on that hourly rate?
Carb-free fluid, yes.
Yeah, carb-free.
So it may have electrolytes in it, may not, depending on what you require. But yes, carb-free. So that the idea then is if it gets really hot and you start drinking a lot more, you're not going to potentially overdo it from a carbohydrate perspective. You know, unless you're someone who's like, well, if I drink this much more, then I can take one less gel. But that's a lot of mental arithmetic to do mid-race that most people probably don't have the mental capacity for halfway through a race.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the idea of a fixed carb intake, you know, fixed fluid intake, and then adjustment. And then also you can adjust your carb intake just through some extra gels or other products on course. So it does certainly make life easier when you, as you say, when you start getting fatigued and you're like, oh God, what am I calculating here? You know, if you keep it simple, then it often helps a lot with the athlete. Okay. Very good. Thank you, mate. Let's focus on today and wrap up this review paper. So this is all about after exercise, sodium intake after exercise. And we'll just go through the rationale, same as we've done in the last two episodes, and discuss those. And we'll start with rationale number one. Sodium post-exercise increases thirst drive and ad libitum fluid intake, just, you know, fluid intake as and when you want to do it. Can you explain this rationale?
Yeah, so it's very similar to what we discussed both before and during exercise, is that, you know, those pretzels are making me thirsty analogy, that if you have more sodium in what you're consuming, that will increase, you know, as it absorbs into the blood, it'll either increase the osmolality in the blood or at least stop it falling, and therefore stimulate thirst to a greater extent than it would if you didn't have that sodium there. So that's kind of the rationale behind it. It is a little bit different post-exercise, though, compared to before exercise. because before exercise, presumably you're relatively well hydrated to begin with. And so your osmolality is kind of normal. And so you're actually taking some sodium to increase that osmolality and drive thirst, or at least stop it falling if it's in the fluid that you're consuming rather than having it as food. But in the post-exercise period, if you need to rehydrate, by definition, you've racked up a fluid deficit in the first place. And if you've racked up a fluid deficit in the first place, by definition, your blood sodium concentration should be elevated. There are rare circumstances where that might not be the case, but they're very rare. So if you've got an elevated blood sodium already, you should already have that stimulation for increased thirst because of the fact that you're somewhat dehydrated, and that's to be expected physiologically. So how much adding even more sodium to that is going to drive that even further? Is it necessary? This is an interesting area because when I looked at it, I couldn't find any research that looked at this specifically post-exercise after you'd racked up a fluid deficit. There's a huge amount of research on fluid retention for a fixed volume of fluid post-exercise, which we'll get to in just a minute. But I couldn't find any research really that answered this question in a specifically post-exercise context.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? And rationale too, exactly like you said, which we'll get into. But it's fascinating that there isn't the research on that. And I was thinking about this rationale. It's like, and exactly what you said, like if you need to replace fluid, you're already dehydrated. You're not in that euhydrated state. So as you said, your plasma osmolality is likely increased. So why potentially would you dump more sodium in to increase that thirst when you probably already are a bit thirsty and need just to replace the water or the fluid? But we'll get into that in rationale too. I think if something else that was mentioned in the paper, you focus on the post-exercise sort of period and the 4 R's. So rehydrate, refuel, repair, and the fourth one being rest or relax. How does sodium play into this, and what considerations should the athlete have when considering like additional sodium into that plan? Because I think it is something that I think, again, a lot of athletes think of things in isolation or in silos, like I've got to replace my sodium, I've got to replace my carbs, I've got to replace my protein. Yet when we think about food, how does that play into all those R's?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And when you start to put them together, things start to make a bit more sense in terms of how you interpret this research in context of the real world. But in terms of refuel, well, that's mainly around carbohydrate. Sodium isn't necessarily going to help you there. Repair is more around protein intake. Again, sodium isn't really going to help you there necessarily. So it's more around the rehydrate side of things. Now, the rehydrate really focuses on the volume of fluid that needs to be consumed to prevent a deficit. It's also probably why I think there hasn't been much research in this ad libitum fluid intake post-exercise, because the guidelines are quite prescriptive about, replacing a percentage, usually 120 to 150% of the fluid deficit post-exercise. So maybe the argument is, well, who cares about ad libitum fluid intake? We need to drink a set amount anyway. And I guess then it comes into, okay, well, if you're going to drink a set amount, will the sodium help you retain that? And that's probably segues us into that second rationale.
Yeah, I think it is a great rationale, or great segue, I should say. So let's get into that, because food, and as you said there, food, and I think this is forgotten, and we have touched on this previously, is that food does contain sodium. And a lot of that daily habitual sodium intake, which we discussed as well, your regular diet, or if you're eating more calories, is probably likely going to increase your sodium intake anyway. And then depending on your choice of food, if it's processed, ultra processed foods, then the sodium intake is probably going to be very high as well. So going into rationale 2, sodium post-exercise increases fluid retention and post-exercise rehydration. What did you find with regards to evidence for this? Was it similar to sort of the pre-exercise evidence?
No, completely different. This is the one area of research in sodium replacement that has had the most attention over several decades compared to any of these other things that we've discussed, really. One that people may be familiar with is this concept called the beverage hydration index, and the original paper for that was published in, I think, 2016 off the top of my head, and there's been a few other sort of related papers since then. But I mean, the concept has been around for much longer than that. But the beverage hydration index was basically take people, and that particular paper was done at rest, so we need to put that in the context that we just described before, that it is a little bit different post-exercise. And you give everyone a litre of different types of fluids. So it could be water, it could be milk, it could be juice, it could be sparkling water, it could be, your standard sports drink, it could be a high sodium electrolyte product like a clinical rehydration solution, that kind of thing. And then they measure over, I think it's about 4-hour period, how much you pee out versus how much of that fluid stays in the body. So it's the classic, what we call fluid balance study. So fluid in, how much you drank, fluid out, how much you, because it's at rest, so how much you peed, there's no sweat component here. And then the balance of those, input minus output is the net fluid balance. And so that research showed what a lot of studies earlier had showed, but across a broader range of beverages in a particularly controlled way, that basically the very high sodium beverages were the best retained, along with skim milk and full cream milk. All of your other products, your standard sports drinks, your 6% with a lower sodium, were no better than water in terms of retention. Orange juice, no better than water, like plain water, in terms of retention as well. And so this kind of work, as well as a lot of that other stuff, other research I mentioned before that goes back quite a while, has led to this suggestion that you need sodium in your post-exercise fluid replacement to retain that fluid. So that sounds great in theory, and it is good quality research that's been done to lead to that conclusion. But as you just said before, Scott, this is done in a very isolated, not real world context. So people are sitting in a lab, they drink a drink, they come in possibly fasted depending on the study, and they're not allowed to eat anything during that 4-hour rehydration period. The other thing that is potentially a little bit artificial about it is this concept of fluid balance being fluid intake minus fluid output. And that's fine. The fluid is somewhere between our mouth and our kidneys, but where is it between our mouth and our kidneys? And this becomes potentially important as well, because something's not really hydrating you when it's just sitting in your gastrointestinal tract. It has to be absorbed into the blood to have that effect on blood volume, cell volume, hydration in the way we would traditionally think about it. And fluid balance as a measurement doesn't capture that. So if it's just sitting in the stomach, it's still counted as retained fluid, even though it's not actually in the blood yet. So that's, I guess, a little bit of background around it. But as you said, if you're thinking about all those different hours of recovery and what athletes are doing in the real world, it's very, very unlikely that they're going to stop exercise, having accumulated a big fluid deficit, which means it must have been a pretty big session, whether it's training or race, and then drink a single type of beverage that has no carbohydrate, no protein in it, in isolation, and then eat or drink nothing else for 4 hours afterwards. You've addressed one of your R's and completely ignored all of your other R's. So, yes, in that situation, the high sodium beverages will be better retained, absolutely. But as soon as you start to add some of these other things into the mix, whether that's in a fluid that contains protein and fat, like milk, we see, milk has some sodium, but nowhere near as much. It's just as well retained. If you start to add food into the mix, as you typically would, and then you look at different types of beverages, the type of beverage makes no difference whatsoever. So plain water is retained, quote unquote, just as well as it is with your high sodium beverages if it's consumed alongside food during that period. Now, what does that mean? Well, why is that the case? Well, as you said, there is some sodium in the food that may be contributing. There are other nutrients in the food that may contribute to the osmolality a little bit as well, although we know sodium is the main contributor. But the other issue here is about where that fluid is. So most of that fluid, once you start to add food into the mix, it's going to slow down the emptying of the stomach. And so a lot of that fluid is going to be in the stomach rather than in the blood. And so you could argue, actually, that's not as good. It's not rehydrating you as quickly, even though the fluid balance looks the same. But at the same time, that's the reality. You've got competing interests here. You've got needs for protein, you've got needs for carbohydrate, and needs for fluid. And if we put all those into the mix, of course, it's going to slow down the stomach emptying. So I don't think that's a valid argument to say no, because then you basically say, well, to rehydrate, you're going to have to wait, delay protein intake and carbohydrate intake for more than 4 hours. Well, that's probably not an ideal scenario either. So, yeah, I think what I take from this is in the real world, probably you're going to be eating food. And if you're going to be eating food, it's going to slow down the stomach emptying. It means that water isn't just all shot into the blood all at once, and you generally retain it better because it's not all shot into the blood at once.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? As you actually strip away the isolated research and then start to combine it in the practical world where, as you said, what would we, you think even biggest session of the day, most athletes, what are they going to do? They're probably going to consume a post-exercise shake.
If not a meal.
And a meal, potentially. But I think of most athletes, they love their shake. And so what it's in that shake, generally milk, whether it's cow's milk or a nut juice, some protein powder, maybe some fruit, extra carbs. And that alone may help with fluid restoration and retention just simply by the constitutes of what made up that shake without the additional need for, adding in a sodium supplement into it. And I think there's also the financial implications of this for athletes to think about. You don't have to use, some of your precious electrolytes in that post-exercise beverage if it does contain things like milk, protein, carbs, because you will retain that fluid anyway, and if you're eating as well. So, it again, from a practical perspective and recommendation, it can save you money. And maybe not achieve anything special, although I do want to dive into that, because then there's what you mentioned there, delays in gastric emptying, which could delay the fluid getting into the blood. And this relates to rationale 3, sodium post-exercise restores whole body sodium content for the next exercise bout. Is there any evidence to say that faster restoration of that fluid balance or total body sodium would not be of benefit to the athlete if additional sessions are to be completed that day or within 24 hours? And you mentioned, and I know there's a lot of questions going on here, but you also mentioned about that 150, 120, 150% up to 200% of fluid replacement that we would recommend to get in. How does that all fit into this? And how does additional sodium, if someone was like, well, I want to focus on rehydration here rather than repair and refueling, how does that fit into this equation?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because if you say, okay, well, I think the rehydration part is super critical, but the refuel and repair is not super critical, I guess I'd probably say, what is an exercise session where refuel or rehydrate is more important than refuel? I'm not sure I can think of one. Not to say that rehydrate is not important, of course, and maybe the repair is the bit that you're sacrificing potentially. If you've got to back up 2 sessions with a pretty short break in between, then maybe the carbohydrate and the sodium and the fluid are the important ones, and you can ditch the protein, or at least deprioritize the protein a little bit. I'd be thinking this is where you've got to back up within maybe an hour or 2, though.
Maybe in a hot environment.
Yeah, possibly.
They've done a hot environment. They've lost quite a lot of fluid, percentage of body weight.
And they know they're going to lose a lot more in the next one as well.
Yeah, they've done a hard bike. They've sweated a lot. They've taken in carbs. They've taken in fluids, but they still have managed to lose, let's call it 3% body weight. They've now got to go out and do a run. It's not a brick, but it's, let's call it an hour later. They're getting told they've got to go out and do a hard, 90-minute run session in the heat. Is that potentially where you could think about, that now you're in post-exercise, pre-exercise, trying to get your fluid back up? Is that where you could use sodium and hyperhydrate in between?
Yeah, exactly. And this is, I guess, then it also blurs the line by, are you now talking about post-exercise rehydration, or are you back to talking about pre-exercise hydration?
Yeah.
Where do you draw the line between the two? It's not obvious. But yes, you're right. I think this is the one area where you're like, maybe I'm going to have to set the protein repair side aside and just focus on getting the carbohydrate and the fluid back in. And in this case, yes, the sodium would definitely help with the retention here. So yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? But as you say, and that's the complicated thing with a multi-sport is, you've got, the swim, bike, run in if we're talking about triathletes, and you've got this post-exercise period, but then a pre-exercise period all in one day, potentially, especially as you see this with higher performing athletes. And I imagine, and we will get to this in the wrap up of this, is like, where does research need to focus on? And is it some of those types of athletes and those scenarios where we just don't really know, I guess. The rationale 3, sodium post-exercise restores whole body sodium content for the next exercise bout. As we touched on there, few nuances around it. Heat acclimation research has supported this notion of conservation of sodium. And actually, I'll get you just to recap on that conservation of sodium before I get into this sort of the idea of heat acclimation, which I did discuss with Dr. Lindsay Hunt from Precision Hydration. And for those of you who want to recap on that heat acclimation episode, you can listen to that. But can you explain, conservation of sodium, and then how heat acclimation plays a role in that as well?
Yeah. So conservation of sodium happens through both the kidneys and the sweat glands. So the kidneys obviously producing the urine, sweat glands producing sweat. We know that if you go into a significant sodium deficit for a period of time, both your kidneys and your sweat glands are going to start conserving sodium. So the kidneys do this within a matter of hours of that sodium deficit. So you see a big drop in the amount of sodium in your urine, and the sweat glands will do this you see the effect within a day or two of a really low sodium diet, which was part of my PhD. But heat acclimation fits into this. It's not 100% clear whether this is the same effect just through forced sodium loss through sweating as part of the heat acclimation, which is similar to just restricting sodium intake. Essentially, you're providing a sodium deficit either on the intake side or the output side, or whether it's a separate effect. There's probably some evidence that would say it's the same effect. Some evidence says maybe there are two separate effects here that are kind of working together. But yeah, you're right. So with heat acclimation, you see a drop in sweat sodium concentration over time as well. So yeah, that's essentially what's going to happen. In terms of the post-exercise period then, what you're going to see is if you've had a big sodium deficit during exercise. So if we go back from the previous episode, we talked about that 5-hour study in the lab where they racked up a 5,500 milligram sodium deficit in the placebo group. So they replaced no sodium at all, which had no impact on heart rate, no impact on body temperature, on perceived effort, or any of those sort of things. But they had this huge sodium deficit, and we actually captured all their urine for the 24 hours after that 5-hour run. And the first time I ran some of these samples through the machine to actually analyze the sodium content in that urine, I thought the machine was broken because the values were so incredibly low. I'd never seen values that low before. But it just kept happening over and over again. We recalibrated the machines, and as we got through each participant, we saw the same thing. So what we saw is this effect playing out post-exercise. So they'd lost a huge amount of sodium through their sweat during the 5 hours of running, and the kidneys then compensated for that post-exercise by dramatically reducing the amount of sodium that was being lost in the urine in the 24 hours afterwards. And the reduction was by about 2/3 compared to what it was in the sodium trial, where they were replacing 100% of their sodium losses, so theoretically had no sodium deficit at all. Now, because their dietary intake was not, we didn't increase it post-exercise, we just kept it the same as it was for the 3 days prior to that 5-hour run. Despite the kidneys conserving the sodium, they didn't get it completely back to sodium balance, because you obviously can't negatively conserve sodium. You can only conserve what's there to be conserved. So it didn't get them back to complete sodium balance after 24 hours, but it certainly meant that there was no reason to completely replace the sodium deficit like you would replace the fluid deficit that we just talked about before.
Yeah, so the long and the short of that is, whilst the kidneys were amazing at conserving, they just can't replace it or conserve it all. So some sodium replacement would be or could be recommended, but it doesn't have to be 100%.
Yeah, well, this is then when it gets tricky, because it comes back to what you were just talking about before with the heat acclimation, is if you go into a sodium deficit for more than a couple of days in a row, you're going to start to conserve sodium through your sweat glands as well. And your kidneys over those days. So if you think about like a multi-day event, you might be thinking, okay, well, I got a big sodium deficit on day one. I want to be back to where I started for the start of day two. But if you're not, what's going to happen is you're going to start to lose less sodium in your sweat. And then day three, you're going to lose less again. Day four, you're going to lose less again. Now, this hasn't been well studied in a sort of performance athletic context. It's been studied in terms of conscientious objectors during World War II. But, theoretically at least, I don't think you necessarily have to get back to sodium balance by the time the next exercise bout starts, because your sweat glands and your kidneys are simply going to adapt to that, just like they would if you went on a low sodium diet for a week, which we talked about a couple of episodes ago, or just like happens during heat acclimation, which we just talked about before.
Yeah, so I guess when I'm thinking about this, like the rationale to take in some sodium afterwards may not be to replace whole body sodium, because your body's going to probably, adapt to that. However, you may take in that sodium if the role is then to try and hyperhydrate or replace and get you.
Correct.
So it's a different rationale for taking in that. So it's not about replacing your total body sodium. It's actually about getting the fluid balance right and getting the fluid back in as rapidly and retaining that. And so I think that's really good for athletes to hear, is like there's all different things proposed for why you should take sodium in afterwards. But some of them may not be required and some of them may be required. And so think about why you're doing it. It's always the why, isn't it? It comes back to the why. Like, why are you doing this, and think about why you're doing that, not necessarily what you're being told, but what is your purpose with that sodium intake.
Yeah, and coming back to what we were saying before, 5 hours of exercise, 5,500 milligrams sodium deficit, we didn't see an effect on anything of importance to athletes. So if you go into day two of a multi-day event a little bit underdone on sodium, as long as hydration is okay, as you just said, you've retained adequate fluid, there's no reason to suggest, or no reason at this stage to think that, because you're starting with, 500 milligrams or 1,000 milligrams less sodium in your body at the start, that's going to be a problem. And it comes back to the theme of all three of these episodes really is that the sodium is about balancing what you want from a fluid perspective, not that there's this magic sodium store that we have to prevent depletion of to prevent something bad from happening.
Fluid being king. And, the sodium, I guess, this king and queen sort of analogy, they work together, but, one might take precedence. Okay, rationale 4, sodium restriction post-exercise reduces restoration of total body water and therefore body mass prior to the following day's competition. We discussed this with, I think it was during exercise. Pre-exercise.
Pre-exercise, yeah.
Pre-exercise, especially with weight category type athletes. And then this was a really interesting one reading this, because we're talking, and you gave the example about cyclists. And so this should pique the interest of cyclists hearing this one, because you've got a multi-stage event and your next day is a lot of climbing, and you're thinking, can I reduce my body weight by restricting sodium after that day's in order to keep my body weight down so I can climb faster? I read that and I hear myself saying that, and I'm like, that is a ridiculous thing to even consider. However, I'm sure it is done, and anecdotally we hear reports of this. What pros, cons, practical? What do you think of?
Yeah. So this was the other one I mentioned at the start. The weight category sport one was actually one that the reviewers suggested I added. I didn't have that in there originally, and this was the other one they suggested I added, and this was based on their anecdotal experience that cyclists at professional level have played around with this. I think the couple of things here. One is that there's not great evidence that this would actually reduce body weight because, as we discussed before, once you start adding fluid into the mix, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to retain less fluid because of all the issues around the gastric emptying and so on, and the nutrients in that food. We know that, sodium will help you retain or not retain fluid in the short term, but we're talking a few hours. So possibly even, 15 to 20 hours. Well, it hasn't been studied specifically during that time period, as in from the end of one day stage to the start of the next one. It's every chance that it's not going to actually make much difference at all. And then the second reason, and I think what comes back to what you're alluding to, Scott, is like, would this actually be advantageous or not? To, yes, being lighter might help going up a hill, but if that comes at the expense of hydration, do the benefits outweigh the downsides? This is an interesting area because it is actually a little bit controversial whether, trading off hydration for mass when you're cycling uphill is advantageous or not. I don't think we have a clear answer to that at this stage. I've heard arguments both for and against this. But I would say on the whole, I would probably not be recommending this unless you're a professional athlete with, individualized sports science support that can look at this in a lot of detail and experimenting around with this in training in a very controlled environment with, very precise data analysis and all of that sort of thing. So if you're a professional athlete working with that level of support, maybe you can try it in training. But I wouldn't be recommending that people just go out and do this in a multi-stage race because theoretically it's a good idea.
Yeah, and I think that's wise words. We know that there will be detriments to performance through increased percentage of body weight loss through fluid. And I think, as you say, some athletes may be able to cope with that. We know that higher performing athletes or better athletes in terms of athletic performance can cope with higher amounts of percentage body weight loss compared to, say, recreational or average athletes. And then it's the support, isn't it? It's really dialing in. Can you do that in training, extended periods of time, multiple times, in order to be able to, assess whether it has a performance gain? I think it's certainly something I would never recommend to Joe Average to go and do, because I think it's going to end more in disaster than a 1% gain.
Yeah,
and that 1% could be super important when you're talking Tour de France or a multi-stage sort of tour event. But when you're talking about a person who just wants to get through a 3-day, cycling ride around South Africa or Australia or whatnot, or the Alps, you just wouldn't recommend it.
And that's, of course, assuming that it actually works.
And we don't know. So,
yeah.
So that probably fits into the next bit, which is unanswered questions and future research. I mentioned at the start of this series that we discussed the future and what is required to further understand sodium and its role in athletic performance. I also mentioned at the start of this episode, or we discussed that it's a review paper, and your research into the available research, including some of your own research that you've conducted yourself. In your opinion, what needs to happen next? What would you love to see researched? And you outlined quite a few things in the paper. Why don't we just start at the top?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things that I think would be good to look at. We mentioned the last episode around the sodium performance piece, that probably sodium only has a positive impact on performance via an indirect mechanism in terms of encouraging and supporting better fluid intake as a behavior. And if we get better fluid intake, then that might improve performance. But we also mentioned that the actual studies that have looked at this, there's very few of them, and a lot of them have some pretty significant methodological issues with them. So I'd say that's an area that that can do with a lot more research is the sodium replacement and performance outcomes. It just boggles me that there hasn't been more emphasis on this, particularly when industry has funded a lot of the research. So that's an interesting one. Another one is looking at the type of sodium or the form of sodium that you're consuming during exercise. So if we rewind to maybe 2010, the vast majority of products on the market were providing sodium in the form of sodium chloride, just basic table salt, and a lot of the traditional mass market sports drinks, that's still the case. But over time, what we've seen is a lot of products start to use more sodium citrate rather than sodium chloride as the source of sodium. The rationale being, well, the sodium's the important part kind of thing. But there are some potential differences apart from the taste, which is why they've done that. But there are some potential differences in terms of the way that sodium chloride is going to have an effect on osmolality, on the way that sodium is conserved or not conserved, because generally sodium and chloride move together from a regulatory point of view in the body. So if you're replacing all of the sodium and none of the chloride, what is the impact of that going to be? And so there's some unanswered questions at this stage where there may be some theoretical ways that we could look at this and go, well, I think this is going to happen, but we haven't actually studied it to say this is definitely what does happen. So look, I think at the end of the day, a lot of products have moved to sodium citrate, and we haven't seen this huge epidemic of problems occurring during in races. Like there hasn't been this big spike in electrolyte balance related DNFs or hyponatremia or anything like that. So I suspect that the answer is that there's not going to be much difference. If there may be a difference, but it's relatively subtle, or there may be no difference, but we don't know the answer to that question at this stage. So that's another big one.
On the sodium citrate, it is interesting as well, isn't it? Because like if you look at some of the arguments against like the higher amounts of sodium, like milligrams per liter, where I think it was like 150 milligrams per 100 mils, you start to have issues with palatability, especially when it's sodium chloride. Yet with sodium citrate, again, if we use an example of something like, the pH 1500, they're using sodium carbonate, sodium citrate, and sodium chloride. And that 1500 milligrams per liter is very palatable. So now you've got this change of like, oh, actually it is possible to get in 1500 milligrams per liter and still taste pretty good. So the palatability part of the equation is removed. And yeah, I'd love to see more research done on that, as you say, comparing sodium chloride to these other forms of sodium, because now you're allowing athletes to overcome that palatability issue, which, as you say, it doesn't seem to be causing any major issues with electrolyte imbalances. So maybe there is something there, and maybe it is allowing athletes to, hyperhydrate better or recover faster?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of other unanswered ones. A lot of the research that we do with sodium, deliberately we put the sodium in capsules to blind it so people don't know what they're getting, which is important from a research point of view. So we can give them sodium capsules or placebo capsules like we did in that 5-hour study that I mentioned before. But the downside to that is it does bypass key parts of the digestive tract that may have a role to play in this whole sodium story. And just in the last couple of weeks, actually, there's been a study using a sodium mouth rinse. So you swish it around, spit it out again. And that wasn't looking at sort of performance, was more around sort of muscle activation and things like that, but suggesting that there may be an effect of sodium mouth rinsing with sodium chloride. So the mouth rinsing piece is another one that I think is really interesting and hasn't been really explored in a sodium context. We've done it with caffeine, we've done it with carbohydrate, but we haven't really done it in any great detail with sodium. So I'd like to see more work done in that space as well.
Now, on that one, it is interesting, and this is just an anecdotal experience of like chewing on the salt tab, like having a fairly significant cramp started cramping and during running, and just chewing on those salt tabs, not swallowing it even, swishing it around, and then actually, and it certainly seemed to have an impact. So it's sort of that anecdotal experience, and I've certainly heard it from athletes, those chew tabs, and something to do with the mouth, a bit like, these hot shots and the cramp fix
pickle
and
juice.
all that. Pickle juice, like, and something in the mouth, these buccal, is it the buccal?
Oh, there's the TRP
glands,
receptors. Yeah.
all that.
Yep.
Like it is fascinating, and I mean, fantastic. Imagine you don't actually even have to swallow the liquid. You can just focus on having something in your mouth, like some type of sodium chew or shot that you can swish in your mouth, and it could help. Again, for athletes who can't consume a lot of fluid on the run because maybe they're running too quick or just have issues with that, it could be something.
Again, does it need to be sodium chloride? Can it be sodium citrate? Does it matter?
It tastes good, yeah. Suddenly, something that actually tastes pretty good in your mouth doesn't leave you feeling like you've just swallowed a bunch of salt seawater.
Yep.
It'd be interesting to see that.
Yep.
Anything else? The other thing, I was going to ask you, like females versus males. What have we seen in the research here? Are we just lacking a lot of research with women at this point in time?
Yeah, I would say so. And that's pretty standard across the board in most areas of sports nutrition research. Energy availability is probably the rare exception to that. That said, that I wouldn't say that there's no research in females here, and what we have seen to date would suggest that there's no reason to think that the results will be different in females compared to males in this sort of sodium area. But that said, we can do a lot more research with female participants. So yeah, absolutely, that would be one. And the other big one is, I guess, the level of athletes. So elite athletes versus more recreational athletes. And again, this is pretty much across the board. We really lack data at the very elite level because it's a very small number of people and they're busy training and things and don't want to have that training interrupted to participate in research studies for a large part. There are ways around that, some creative ways that have been used in recent times, but it is difficult to do that. And I guess the flip side to that I'll add in here is that a lot of the time you hear people bemoan this fact on social media or in discussions and go, oh, this research is useless, it's not in elite athletes. And I just think that's the biggest disrespect to the 99% of people who are on the start line of a marathon or a triathlon or a mass participation event of any kind, because yes, that may not help you working with the Olympic athlete that you're working with, but it is completely relevant to the other 99% of people that are on the start line. And so it really pisses me off, frankly, when I hear that sort of comment that, yes, that may be the case if you're working with this very small group of athletes, but that doesn't mean that the research is useless or not applicable or can't be used at all, because there's a very large group of people that deserve attention that it is completely applicable to.
I'm sitting here laughing because A, I've never heard you swear, and B, you think about who buys these products. It's the masses that buy them. So look at the research that applies to, we always go there. When you're reading a research paper, look at the population studied. Is it applicable to you? And if so, okay, the research may be, it will be applicable to you. But if it's, complete elite athlete on the flip side of this, does that maybe trickle down to you? Yes. But maybe more research done on Gen Pop and understanding all these different components is, I would argue, probably more valuable, because it's the percentage. It's the larger percentage of athletes that are doing this, that are trying all these different, and look, it's exactly the same with carbs, isn't it? You see all this, just, what's the word? Purpley? What's around it? Around 120, 150, 200 grams of carbs. And it's for majority of athletes, you don't need anywhere near that. Yet you'll see these arguments that, I'm not taking in enough, and it's not, the research isn't for me. And it's think about what applies to you first and foremost, and what research is available in that respect. So I'd love to see more research done on, we mentioned that one study, I think it was with fixed sodium intake in 70.3, and what the results were, and what they sort of found that, okay, it did appear to increase fluid consumption. Now, again, it was all retrospective. It was anecdotal sort of feedback and recall. Can we do more studies in, events like 70.3s, Olympic, Ironman events that we start to collect more and more information on the masses, I think it would be fantastic to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I guess a couple of extra things to add to there. Running versus cycling is potentially very different. So the vast majority of research is done in cycling because it's very easy to study cycling. You can put people on a stationary bike in a lab, you can dial up a certain power output, or you can measure if it's variable intensity, sort of the time trial type thing. You can measure second by second what that power output is. So it's very easy to study. Much more difficult to do in running. One, because just time on legs, people don't want to spend 2 or 3 hours running in a lab if they could be doing that 2 or 3 hours running outdoors for training. So it is a little bit more difficult to recruit, I think, runners. But also, if you think about something like a time trial with a motorized treadmill, motorized treadmills are fixed pace, and you've got to consciously adjust the pace of the treadmill to change it. And so you can't do really a proper time trial performance test in the lab with that style of treadmill. The one exception to that maybe is the new Wahoo treadmill that is variable speed, and that may be a bit of an unlock in terms of a research tool in the future to do sort of more legitimate running time trials. But I think the reason that running is potentially quite different to cycling, particularly cycling without major hills, is that running is a weight-bearing sport. So you've got to physically carry that weight with you the whole way. And so the more weight you've got, the more energy it costs to move your body at a certain pace. And it comes back to what we were saying before in terms of that reducing weight from fluid versus your performance benefit. That relationship may be slightly different in running versus cycling. But we have very little running research, so it's hard to know that for sure.
Yeah, it's like all things, isn't it? More research required, and you just need institutions and companies. And, again, you mentioned bias right at the start. Unfortunately, if these companies do put forward their products and the money, which is required for research, there's always the risk that people will read the research and say, oh, conflict of interest. It was supplied by Precision or LMNT or Morton or whatever it was that produce these products. But in a way, that's sort of where this has to go, because, if we're going to find out, they probably have to be funding the research to actually see if it all makes sense.
Yeah. And probably the final one I didn't mention, which I think is important as well, is particularly for the ultra endurance events. And that's where particularly that modeling we talked about in the last episode in terms of maintaining a stable blood sodium becomes more and more important, is that is theoretical modeling. We need more data in those really long events, but it is incredibly difficult to do, which is why it hasn't been done to date. So to track people's fluid intake during 15, 20 hours of continuous exercise, very difficult to do accurately. Track sodium intake, track sweat sodium losses with the patches that we've traditionally had for measuring that's been very difficult. I know there was a research team, I think, that tried to do that at Western States one year, but putting patches on people that are already sweaty and dirty 3/4 of the way through an event, the patches just fell off. They didn't stick properly. But I think we have some opportunities now with the new kind of wearable sweat devices that, once they're validated, that we can track that continuously over a period of time and actually see what happens after, we've measured it out to, I think we did it for 5 hours in our study. There's one that's gone to 7, but there really hasn't been anyone who's measured it systematically beyond 7 hours. So to see what happens after that, we've got some ideas of what may or may not happen, but until we measure it, we can't confirm that for sure. So there is some things, and I do talk about that in the paper, that some of these conclusions are made based on theoretical evidence and modeling because we just don't have the research studies to say for sure that that's the case. We think that's probably what's going to happen, but until we have the data, we can't be 100% sure.
Yeah, I read Killian, I'll probably mess up his last name. I'll pronounce it really badly as an Australian. Killian Jornet, is it?
Yeah.
They did his recent review, I think, of his 100-mile effort from last year. And then I think there was also Caleb Olsen, I think the guy who won it. I think they tried to quantify. My understanding is, and if I'm recalling the paper correctly, they quantified carbohydrate intake and fluid intake and sodium amount ingested, but didn't look at actually collection of sodium during the race. Like you say, I think things like H-Drop and Flow Bio and devices like that weren't utilised. But yeah, it's exciting that they're at least starting to think about trying to get an understanding. And what you saw in both those papers were really large amounts of carbohydrates consumed, very large amounts of fluid consumed. And, I think one of them I can record took in a decent amount of sodium as well. So I think all this real world research, as you say, to try and get further understanding of the modeling is required. And, hopefully with these new devices, you mentioned technology improving all the time. Unfortunately, some of the tech has been a lot of promise and not much deliverance. But, hopefully, I know you're testing some of those devices now and validating their use. I think it's all very exciting for the future of, sports performance.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right, mate. Anything you want to say before wrapping up? I'll give you the floor, and I just want to thank you again. Fascinating 3-part series, fascinating review paper. I thought, as I said, I think it was very well balanced, despite maybe some inherent bias. I think you did a great job at sort of, saying where things can be useful and where things may be not so useful, and then really structuring it very well in that way. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's right. I think I'll finish off by just saying that I think traditionally how we've sort of thought about sodium replacement has been, oh, it's hot, I'm going to sweat a lot, therefore I need to replace a lot of sodium. So it's kind of this assumption that if I lose a lot of sodium, I need to replace a lot of sodium. And if I don't lose much sodium, I don't need to replace much sodium. But that thought is based on fluid loss. It's based on sodium loss, but it's not based on fluid intake or fluid replacement. So I think that's probably as I was going through this and doing the studies for my PhD and then that next one, the 5-hour study, as I started to crunch all of that, I was sort of thinking in the back of my mind, what's the practical message that can come out of this? And does it change what we already know or the way we've already kind of thought about this? And I think the thing that it really changes, and that modeling paper as well, is to say, we can't consider the sodium replacement until we've considered the fluid replacement. So it's not just that we lose a lot of fluid and sodium, therefore we need to replace sodium. It's we're losing a lot of fluid and sodium and we're replacing a lot of the fluid, therefore the sodium is necessary. If we're losing a lot of fluid but not replacing much fluid, like shorter events, then we don't need to replace much sodium either. So we need to keep the sodium replacement in context of the fluid replacement. And I encourage people to figure out the fluid replacement first and then look at the sodium as the complement to that rather than as two separate issues.
Yeah, perfect. And for those who want to understand their fluid losses, there's a very easy way of doing that within FuelN, using the sweat rate calculator and testing system. It also allows you to capture your carb capacity and how much carbs you're taking in during your sessions. But that understanding of your sweat loss and your sweat rate, and then also your fluid intake, it's, so many athletes have really found that extremely beneficial to improving their race performance and understanding what their actual personalized needs are. So I think, Al, you said it perfectly. Thank you for that. And yeah, to everyone listening, please check out the link. You can read the full review paper. The link is in the notes. And we look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on this episode. Thanks, Al.
All right. Thank you.